It's hard to believe that Donald Trump has been president of the United States for less than 100 days at this point, given the whirlwind of actions and controversies that have erupted from the White House. When it comes to assessing what's happened and what will happen, there's no one better to talk to than historian Heather Cox Richardson. I'd love to ask you first off, how would you describe, as the historian, the first 2 months of this current Trump administration?
Well, we are watching the deliberate dismantling of American democracy. So, how I would describe it in a single word is catastrophic, frightening, any number of those words. But we are seeing the attempt to destroy, our foreign relations, our government that supported ordinary Americans, all the different ways in which we have built this particular government over our 248-year history, and at least over the last 80 years, we're tearing apart, which is, horrific. And yet we are being able to judge what's happening and maybe find ways to push back on that.
When we spoke about a month ago, I asked you if we were in the midst of a constitutional crisis. You answered in the affirmative. So, where are we now, 1 month later?
So it's funny you say that, because you can see the mainstream media is beginning to pick up the idea that we really are in trouble, especially in this moment, because of the ways in which the Trump administration and MAGA supporters are going after the federal judiciary. That's a really big deal. But I identified it earlier on than that, because the Trump administration, with the Department of Government Efficiency and whatever it is that Elon Musk is doing, was deliberately dismantling a number of agencies that Congress had put into place. And that was an attack on the constitutional powers of Congress and also of specific laws. So we've been in trouble now for a while, and it's not getting better. It's actually getting worse. Now, I'm trying to put a somewhat positive spin on this, because it bothers me when people say, oh, that's it, we're done. We're certainly not done yet. There are ways in which we can resist this. But one of the things that I have found very interesting this week, which is the week of March 20th, we're recording this on, is that with Trump going after U.S. District Judge Boasberg, for example, and the other ways in which he has pushed against the legal underpinnings of the United States, seems to have woken up a lot of people who were willing to fudge other things that disturb people like me. And now, for example, you're seeing a lot of op-eds around the country with people saying, wait, we have a real problem here. So maybe at the rate at which they're moving and the extremes at which they are reaching will help us to wake up earlier rather than later to push back against the dismantling of our government.
Let's take a step back and help people understand what happened with this federal judge and why he asked the Trump administration to turn planes around that were carrying alleged Venezuelan gang members, and the 1798 Alien Enemies Act that the administration used as a legal basis for doing so. So, can you first talk about this act and how you feel it was used by the administration?
Yeah, sure. So the Alien Enemies Act is, as you say, from 1798. And what it says is that in times of war, or when the United States is being invaded, the president can deport people who are over 14 years old. Now, originally, as the law was written, that was males over 14 years old. It actually got expanded later on. But people over 14 years old without going through the due process of the courts. But step back for a minute. In order to do what Trump did over the last weekend, and of course, it's worth remembering that he was actually in Florida golfing, and it appears that it was Stephen Miller and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem who put this plan into place. But what the administration did was that Trump secretly invoked this Alien Enemies Act and said he was going to put it into place. But what that does is it only operates if we're under attack. So what he said was that there were gang members from Venezuela in the United States, members of this gang, and that because, and this is how he constructed it, because they were working with the Venezuelan government, Therefore, Venezuela was invading the United States. So he invoked it under those circumstances. And then within that, they rounded up, and we still do not have a list of the names of the men that were put on what appear to have been 3 planes. But they put these people on these planes, and they did not deport them to Venezuela. They took them to El Salvador and put them into a notorious prison where the United States will be paying for their maintenance there for about a year. And they just said, these are gang members, but we don't know who they were. And a number of their family members said, well, actually, they're not gang members. And they only knew their family members were there because they saw them on video. And they said they're not gang members. And then on March 17th, one of the leaders of this deportation or extradition, whatever you want to call it, gave a declaration to the court, a sworn declaration to the court, in which he said that many of those deported, many was his word, many of those deported do not, in fact, have criminal records. That, in fact, what he says is that without criminal records, all that proves is that they've done stuff that we don't know. So they're worse even than we thought. But think about what that is. That is the government saying, we believe that these people are criminals. Now, there's no evidence they are, but we believe that they are criminals. And therefore, we are declaring that the country from which they come is invading the United States, and we are extraditing them to, a black hole prison. And that there are some differences between the El Salvador prison and a black hole prison. I overstated on that, but we're delivering them to this really bad news prison. That completely undermines the American rule of law, which says you're innocent until proven guilty, and that you have to go through certain laws before, for example, you can be deported, and so on. So when we talk about what the judge did, what the judge said, all he said was, first of all, you cannot say we're being invaded. So you cannot use that law because we're not being invaded until you show me evidence for why you think that's the case. So all he's done is put a hold on this. And it is a pretty reasonable hold looking at it from the larger picture of what's happening.
Let's talk about sort of everything that was wrong with what the Trump administration did. It misused this act from the 1700s. It declared Venezuela an enemy, and it denied these people of due process.
Right. And so why does this matter to the average person on the street? Well, first of all, if the president can say that we are being invaded by Venezuela simply on his own say so. Now, again, for all you and I know, there's some secret orders out there that we don't know about, but he has not provided those to anybody, including the courts that do have the facilities to examine evidence like that. If in fact he can say that, he could say that about any country. And if in fact he said that about any country, then he would have taken the ability to control immigration away from Congress, where the courts have always said it belongs, and taken it into his own hands. So what that would do then is give the president the sole power to decide who can come into the country and who gets deported from the country, which again is a complete overturning of everything the courts have always said, that Congress is the body of one of the branches of government that should have control over immigration. So that's the first thing that's wrong with this. And then when you look at the issue of the due process that people living in America have the right to have, first of all, we do not know who those men were. For all we know, there was a U.S. citizen in there. But in any case, there are procedures in place for deportation, including for deportation of criminals, that have been in place for a long time, that he simply declared he didn't need to do. Well, what does that mean? It means that if the president can decide who gets to come into the country and who gets deported, and can simply decide who those people are, really none of us are safe. Because if you are getting imprisoned and extradited based on what the president says, somebody's put it very nicely, I think, to say that when we talk about due process, we should actually call it fact-finding. That what due process does is it establishes the facts of who you are and whether or not you've committed a crime. And until you have the protections that those will be in place, none of us have any protections.
What would you say, Heather, to people who feel perfectly comfortable with this, who think hey, these people were bad guys. They were, part of the gang. They were wreaking havoc on the streets of America. We need to be rid of these individuals. And they're perfectly fine with the administration making those kinds of decisions.
You know, what one of the things you see a lot if you're reading right-wing media or watching right-wing media, as I do, is that people who are objecting to the deportation of these men want more rapists and murderers on the streets of the United States. And my answer to that is, first of all, that's ridiculous. Like, if you think about your lifetime, when has somebody said to you, we need more of around here? We need more rapists and murderers. I mean, that's just not something that the vast majority of us revert to, right? So, first of all, you can kind of dismiss the idea that people like me who are objecting to this want there to be more crime. Nobody says we want more crime. What I would say to people is that this is why we have a body of laws. And you can think of times in our history in which you could go to prison based on someone's say so. And you can certainly think of cases in other countries where simply doing something that the person in power doesn't like leads you into prison, like Syria until very recently, or like Russia, for example, right now, or any authoritarian country. When you start to say, we don't have to pay attention to the laws for these people that we don't like, and a rising authoritarian government will deliberately go after people that they can that they can say, you don't like those people. They
Or
start.
people who are hard to defend, right, Heather? Like Mahmoud Khalil or these Venezuelan alleged gang members.
Right. And so when that happens, once you have let that go, it's very hard to start pulling that back and say, well, it was okay that you took a gang member that had committed a murder. And therefore it's also okay that you took a gang member who hadn't actually committed a murder. And then it's okay that you took somebody who maybe was a gang member. And then it's okay that you took somebody who wasn't a gang member. And then it's okay that you took somebody who it appears was on that plane, one of those planes, who was actually in the legal channels for getting asylum. You start to hit a really slippery slope there. And where do you think it's going to stop?
It's the proverbial frog in the boiling water, isn't it?
That's right.
Let me ask you about the judiciary branch, because federal courts have long been a check on executive power. Yet the administration openly ignored Judge James Is it Boasberg? Am I
I
pronouncing his
believe
name
so, yeah.
correctly? James Boasberg's order to return the plane. So I think many people are concerned by what happens if the Trump administration simply ignores the courts.
Right. First of all, we are not certain that they deliberately ignored the order. That is still being hashed out in court. And when you and I are talking, the timeline has not yet been established. It certainly looks that way, but let's keep it exactly what we know now. I think a lot of people are worried about the Trump administration not following what the courts say. And you can certainly see since this weekend an attempt on the part of MAGA Republicans to say, we don't care what the courts say. And yet, at the same time, there is, as I say, a lot of pushback on that right now, because people have to understand that if we lose the rule of law, what we have essentially done is lost the idea of the American government. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about a country, you have to think about where power resides and why power resides there. So you can imagine a country, for example, where power resides in a monarch, in somebody who has all the power, because that's the way it's always been traditionally in that country. Or you can imagine other ways in which a country could find its power, and that's known as its sovereignty. Who has the power? And in the United States of America, if you think about our Constitution does not say, as the one before it did, the states got together and decided, which is what the Articles of Confederation said. What our Constitution says is we, the people, are setting out this government. It holds the power of our government in the people. We, the people, are the ones who have the power to establish this government. And the Constitution sets up a way for us to do it. We elect representatives, who then write laws and debate them and eventually pass them. And if they do all those things, they create laws under which we live. And under our Declaration of Independence, we have the right to consent to the government under which we live. Well, if we get somebody who comes in and says, I'm not going to pay attention to the laws, what that person is saying is that he is not going to pay attention to the people who own the power in our government. He's saying, I'm not going to care about that government. I'm going to create my own government that has my own power. And so when we're looking at this moment and this fight over whether Trump actually has to do what the courts say, the real thing is, does Trump have to do what we say? And that's what's really at stake in this moment.
But we, the people, are feeling pretty damn powerless right now because elections aren't every day. And we're watching many people helplessly feeling that they cannot control the president's effort to expand executive power in an unprecedented way. So I know that you get asked this every time we talk, but I get asked this by all my followers and readers. What can people do absent of a midterm election to stop this snowball from gaining speed and danger?
Well, so again, let's step back for a second. Everybody is frightened, and they should be, because this is a really difficult situation. And one of the things that you're seeing in this moment is real frustration, I think, with different pieces of our government, and especially right now with the courts, which are trying desperately to hold back Trump. And yet the courts, by definition, move slowly, and they should move slowly because you want to make sure you come to the right answer. At the same time that you're seeing, for example, the destruction of U.S. aid or the destruction of Social Security, all the different ways in which they are destroying the United States. And the courts can't really stop that because they're going to take too long. And by the time they say this is legal or this is illegal, it
Right,
doesn't.
the damage will have been done as it was with USAID.
So I would like to point out that we do have a remedy for this written into the Constitution. And the remedy that's written into the Constitution, of course, is impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the problem with impeachment is, as we know, the Republicans in Congress refuse to entertain that for Donald Trump, which is itself really interesting. That's the solution for what we have now. That's the solution for what was written into our government. That's how you get rid of somebody who's trying to destroy the country. But the Republicans have so far said, no, we're not going to do that. We're okay with what he does. So where do Americans bring pressure on that system? They do it by doing exactly what they're doing now, by protesting, by showing up in the streets, by putting pressure on their elected representatives, by demanding that people do things to stand against Trump. And one of the things that I think we're seeing a lot of, it's not ending up in as much in the media as it probably should be, is real pushback against individual leaders as well as against the takeover of agencies, for example. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. We simply must make what we want heard, because that is the only way we're going to be able to put pressure on those leaders to do what they ought to do. And just a caveat there, all protests must be nonviolent. In the United States of America, we have a right to do that. But also, whenever a protest becomes violent, people lose enthusiasm for that cause. So I think that's the way we keep doing it. And you're seeing this everywhere now, calls for people to be in the streets.
Let me ask you more about the court, because Judge Boasberg is now the target of an impeachment effort by President Trump and House Republicans, prompting a rare statement from Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who said that impeaching a federal judge is, quote, not an appropriate response to disagreeing with a ruling. How unprecedented is it for this level of political retaliation against the judiciary?
The only time I can think of that looks anything like this is in 1857, when the Supreme Court hands down the Dred Scott decision that says that Black Americans have no rights that white Americans are required to pay any attention to. It also says, and this is what most upset observers in the North in 1857 that Congress has no power to legislate in the territories, which meant that enslavement would spread into the West and the country would become entirely a slave-holding nation because the West and the South would work together to spread enslavement nationally. And when that happened, there was a big push against the Supreme Court in which Horace Greeley of the New York Daily Tribune said that their opinion should be taken with as much weight as that of 10 men in a Washington bar room. But that actually came from political opposition that didn't come from the president himself. And that's a really big difference here. This is the first time really that we have had a president trying to undermine the Supreme Court. Now, people point to Andrew Jackson and his objection to the Supreme Court saying that he couldn't, in fact, remove Native Americans from the East Coast and push them to the West. But one of the things that about that moment with Jackson is, first of all, that is a bit of an apocryphal statement. I have read the two places in which he is alleged to have said that. It's not quite what he said. Even if he did say it, one of the things we tend not to emphasize when we talk about that is that he did put a fig leaf over what he was doing by trying to negotiate treaties. Now, whether or not those treaties were legitimate is a different question, but you didn't have the wholesale attempt to destroy the judiciary. What you are seeing in the United States in this moment is a president who is trying to become a dictator. And in order to do that, he's taken on the Congress. He's trying to destroy the right of Congress to legislate and to have the power of the purse. And now he's taking on the judiciary. Those are the two other branches of the government. Then this would leave him, of course, the one sole branch of the government with him in charge of it.
And despite the fact that people cite Andrew Jackson saying, in essence, they've made the ruling, now let them enforce it, about the Supreme Court, this is truly unprecedented.
What Trump is doing, absolutely. You know, again, as I say, there have been moments in our history when people didn't like what the Supreme Court did. I mean, you and I can think of some in the last few years even, but that's really different than having a president say, I'm going to tear down the judiciary. And that's just not, it's just not a thing that America has done, because until this president, we had three branches of government that always were vying to get more power for themselves at one time or another. That's simply the way power works. But we have never had a president who said, I'm going to destroy the judiciary, which is what we've got now. We certainly have had presidents try to pack the judiciary, and we've seen that recently. But this is the first time we've seen the attempt to say, I don't believe in what you're doing. You do not have the right to do this. And I'm going to go ahead and take all the power into my own hands.
I'd love to ask you about something I'm hearing, a phrase I'm hearing a lot lately, which is anticipatory obedience. And a lot of judges have said they're getting a huge number of death threats. People, basically saying they know where they live. Amy Coney Barrett's sister got a threat of a pipe bomb in her mailbox. Talk about the chilling effect this might have on members of the judiciary branch of our government.
I will do that by talking about our past. You know, one of the things that people often ask when you talk about Reconstruction in the United States, which is the period from the Civil War, and there's a big fight about when Reconstruction actually ends, but at least into the 20th century, there's a big question of why it was possible for the former Confederates to retake control over the American South. And the answer is exactly what you're saying there. It's terrorism. And the idea of terrorism is to create terror in a population. And in order to do that, you do not need to have very many people. So all you need to do is make sure people hear that they could be next. And one person can do an awful lot of damage nowadays with the ability of the internet and other forms of communication to reach into a lot of places. So if you think about it, you probably remember all the studies that people did about the really angry people in fora on the internet, and how when they actually figured out who all those people were, they were a really small handful of individuals. And what they did is, by being in a lot of places, they managed to make people think that there were a lot more of them than there were. And I think that's what you're seeing here, is the attempt to cow a lot of people into acting in ways that a very small group of people want them to. in order for this small group of people to get what they want. And I just want to emphasize here that what we're seeing is the putting in place of, for example, Project 2025, which is that blueprint from a number of right-wing institutions led by the Heritage Foundation to put in place a theocracy in the United States. And when people know what's in Project 2025, do you know what proportion of Americans want to have Project 2025 put in place?
I would imagine a very small amount if they truly understand what it will do.
4%. 4% of Americans actually want this to happen. And you can see around the country enormous numbers of people turning out to say, hey, wait a minute. I wanted US aid to survive. I cared about the National Institute of Health. I wanted public institutions of education. I wanted the Department of Education. I wanted to have a National Weather Service. You're seeing people say this is not what we wanted.
Having said that, Heather, why is Trump's approval rating still at 47% then?
Now, there's a number of different ways to look at Trump versus what I have just said. One of them is that an awful lot of people divorce him from what I just said. So if you look at the polls on any of the things I just talked about, people overwhelmingly want those things to exist. If you put Trump into the mix and say, what do you think of what Trump is doing? They're always willing to back Trump because that's the nature of his cult-like following.
How do you explain that? I mean,
well, there's a lot of different ways to explain it. So one of the ways to explain it is the idea that he has developed this personality cult around himself. But I think more interesting in this moment for us is why do people still, as you say, support him when they don't support what he's doing? And my answer to that would be, we know now that the radical right has built its own information bubble. And that information bubble simply doesn't tell people what's happening out there. So here's an example for you. If you were paying attention last weekend, you knew that we had terrible, terrible storms across this country that killed at least 40 people and devastated huge swaths of Missouri and Arkansas straight across the country under the East Coast, right?
Right.
These were terrible storms. And I was looking at that and I thought, I wonder what the president did about that. Because again, if you were following his social media posts, as I do, he was talking about how he had won the golf championship at his golf club in West Palm Beach. So I was like, did he say anything about these storms? And so I started looking around about it and ended up on the Fox News channel. And what they said on the Fox News channel was that Trump had called out the National Guard in Arkansas in order to deal with the crisis there. And there was all this cheerleading for finally we have a president who'll do something for us and so on and so forth. Well, the National Guard is mobilized by the governor of a state. What happened was that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is the actual governor of Arkansas, is the one who called out the National Guard. But if you were reading the Fox News channel, what you saw was Trump did it, and Biden had never done anything like that. And I think this is the real thing that we're having to grapple with in this country at this moment, is that an awful lot of Americans are not just uninformed, they are misinformed about what is actually happening. And that takes us back to these deportations, where, again, if you read on right-wing media what they are saying is that that people who are opposed to these deportations want there to be more rapists and murderers in the country, / they rely on illegal immigrants for the votes that keep them in power. And therefore, they are willing to permit this to happen so they can win elections. That's a complete myth and fraud. But again, if you live in that ecosystem, it's a great story. I mean, these are not people reading off a sheet of paper and sounding like idiots. They're constructing a worldview that makes a lot of sense when you're sitting within it.
And they're misinformed, these individuals, or completely uninformed, because if there's something that the Trump administration does that is wrong, oftentimes it's not mentioned or, as you said, totally twisted in right-wing media.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about the mobilization of the National Guard. because again, it's not like it was a fight between a Democrat and a Republican. Quite literally, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is a Republican governor of Arkansas, and yet she got virtually no credit on these on these message boards for having called out the National Guard. Instead, Trump did, and I could not find. I won't say that he didn't do anything because I suppose maybe he did, and I couldn't find it because this White House is pretty opaque about what it does. I could not find that he had acknowledged the storms in any way. Now, he might have, but it certainly was not headline news. Didn't matter because, according to the right-wing media, he had been right there right away to take care of the problem, at least in Arkansas. Although, again, that was the governor of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Right before we began this conversation, Heather, news broke that a federal judge in Maryland temporarily blocked top officials in the Social Security Administration from granting Elon Musk and his team access to the agency's data systems. The order further required anyone on Musk's team who had already sifted through sensitive financial data to, quote, disgorge and delete any of that material in their possession. This is not the first time that Elon Musk's power was constrained by a federal judge. Do you think that will have any impact on his activities or the activities of his Doge colleagues?
So listen, I won't predict the future, and I'm not part of that team, so I don't know how they act. But let me ask something in a different way. Why is the Department of Government Efficiency going into all these places where it says they're looking for waste, fraud, and abuse? Although, as we know, they have in fact found virtually none of that, and they keep having to take down what they insist they have found. That happened again just today. Why did they go into those places not with auditors, and they didn't work with the people who were already in place to audit those systems, but rather they went in with people who instantly went for their databases? I mean, it's really pretty astonishing that the first place they went, I believe, was to the Office of Personnel Management, and then they went to the Treasury Department, and then they went into various other agencies where there was a ton of information about the American people. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, why one might do that. So, as we know, there is a huge race on right now for artificial intelligence, to build artificial intelligence systems. And nobody had a bigger treasure trove, maybe not nobody, China might have. But one of the biggest treasure troves of that in the world, of course, was the United States government. Now, do I think that the Doge people who have been breaking laws right and left are suddenly going to do what a judge tells them and disgorge that information? I wouldn't take a bet on it. But I think the bigger question is, what are they going to do with all of the information that they have amassed now about individual Americans and about American society as a whole? And that's something I think we should all be extraordinarily concerned about. Because think about what you can do with that kind of information.
Well, what could they be wanting to get from that data?
So there's a lot of different ways to think about artificial intelligence and about the data that one could have. And in many ways, it can be used in unbelievably beneficial ways. That is, it's sort of a large, it's sort of a giant data set where you can learn all kinds of things about medicine and so on. But think about what one could do with that kind of information. You could, for example, do what we know that advertisers have done since the 1930s. But this is something that has become very important in politics recently. And that is, if you know everybody who lives in a country, you can target ads to people to, for example, convince them to vote for or against a political candidate. So I'm not suggesting they are doing this, but of course I think about politics. If you knew everybody who lived in the United States, and by that I mean you had their tax information, which means you know their children and how old they are, you know whether or not they're disabled or have somebody in their family who's disabled, you know their race, their ethnicity, their income, their housing situation, whether or not they've been a veteran, you know where they work, what they study, and so on and so forth. if you had all that information and you could say, I need to have this percentage of Americans get behind this idea, you could do it.
I mentioned this ruling about Elon Musk and the Social Security Administration, and there's been other pushback against Trump's power grabs. As you know, Heather, U.S. District Judge Theodore Schwang ruled against the dismantling of USAID, finding it was likely unconstitutional, and he based his ruling on the finding that Elon Musk has, quote, acted as a U.S. officer without having been properly appointed to that role by President Trump. So this was the first time a federal judge was acting to constrain Elon Musk, and this is before this latest ruling came out. Again, you ask what they're doing in terms of gathering data about US Americans, but do you think Elon Musk's actions will be constrained by these rulings?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, isn't that the question we're in right now? Will the courts prevail or will Donald Trump prevail? The issue at stake in that particular case is that it is certainly possible for an administration to have members of the administration that either advise them unofficially and have no power or become essentially officers of the government. But if the latter, they're supposed to be approved of by the Senate through the advice and consent clause in the Constitution. And in this case, Trump simply brought Musk on board and tried repeatedly to deny that he was doing anything, even at the same time he was out in front of the cameras and Musk was out in front of the cameras talking about how he was in fact directing the Department of Government Efficiency, which are both things that that judge referred to in his opinion. That opinion is really quite a scathing one. But whether or not, I mean, again, to go back to where I was a little bit ago, whether or not this will stick really depends ultimately on whether the American people will put up with it. But once again, there is a mechanism to deal with this really quite easily that is in our Constitution, and that is impeachment. When a president quite deliberately runs roughshod over the laws, the Congress is supposed to care enough for their own power to step in and stop it. But what we have here is a faction that now runs the Republican Party that recognizes that what they're doing is extraordinarily unpopular because remember, they control the House, the Senate, and the White House. If they wanted to do this legally, they absolutely could. They have the power to do that. Instead, they are trying to get what they want, the smaller government and the end to the social safety net and so on. They want to get that without actually having to go through the normal channels because they know they can't do it. And so they're turning it over to an all-powerful man and his cronies to do it.
And impeachment seems so unlikely, right, Heather? I mean, given that the Republicans in Congress don't even criticize Trump for anything he does, much less, try to impeach him.
Well, they do criticize him. Now, whether or not that's going to have any teeth is another question, because
Do you think
remember,
what Republicans have criticized him, really?
So, well, again, what we see in the news is all Trump all the time because it's very hard to look away. But you have seen, for example, with Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, real complaints about the fact that essentially Trump has taken away from them the power of appropriations. Now, that's a big deal, and they're not being nearly as loud as they could. But I just want to make the point they are criticizing him.
Duly noted.
You are also seeing much more vocally criticism of the Trump administration's recent suggestion that they would give up control of NATO, that the United States will walk away from NATO. And that's the place where I expected to see more pushback is the turn of the United States away from our traditional alliances with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and with Europe, and instead toward Russia. I thought we would see a lot more there, and we haven't. But whether or not I mean, at this point, somebody asked me, what is the one thing that has surprised me? I really thought that the moderate, if you will, the non-MAGA Republicans in the Senate would stand against at least 4 of Trump's appointments that would undermine the United States military and the American people's health. And they didn't. And that really surprised me because the power of the Senate was always considered to be inviolable, and they just tossed it overboard. But if they're not going to do it, the American people are going to need to give all the support they possibly can to those institutions that are standing against Trump. And that, whether or not we will prevail, I can't promise, but I do know that if we don't constantly say that we will not put up with this, it will be a done deal.
What do you mean? What institutions are you referring to?
The institutions that are standing up against Trump are, for example, lots of media out there. There are funny places like large law firms. That matters. Institutions like universities, to the degree that they are standing up against Trump. The courts, obviously. Those members of Congress and people at both the state and the local level who are standing up against Trump. The people who are running for office and trying to get into place in order to make sure that their states will not, for example, be overturned, or their state um, choices will not be overturned by a state Supreme Court. So Wisconsin's got a really big election coming up on April 1st. There's a lot of institutional places that people are trying to stand up against Trump. And that's really important because one of the ways we know that you can regain democracy after a dictator has risen, or that you can protect democracy, is by standing for a lot of different places that are resisting the rise of authoritarianism. So that while Trump is over here screaming about the courts, for example, the universities are over here saying we care deeply about the First Amendment, as the law dean of Georgetown University did over the weekend. And somebody else is over here saying, wait a minute, I care a lot about my Congress members, so I'm showing up at a town hall. And that pressure, overall pressure, will slow down the administration's ability to garner all the power unto itself. And again, remember that administration has weaknesses. It has a lot of weaknesses. Not only is it losing in the ways that I have suggested, but also Trump is not mentally healthy. And I would suggest that Elon Musk is stretched extraordinarily thinly. That is, his Tesla trucks have been recalled today. His companies are hemorrhaging money. He's enormously unpopular. There seems now, according to a report in the Financial Times, to be that about $1.4 billion is missing from Tesla. There's a lot of different ways in which these people are already under pressure. And I think you can see the problems for the administration of that escalating pressure through what seems to me the increasingly hysterical tweeting that's coming from, especially from Donald Trump.
It seems to me that the recent debate over the Republican stopgap spending bill illuminated more than ever before a truly significant fissure within the Democratic Party.
I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem for the Democrats, and I don't think it's a problem for the country. And here's why. I was somebody who wanted to see a showdown. And that doesn't mean I was right to want that. I think it is reasonable on both sides to say you have a point. And one of the things that did worry me about the idea of shutting down the government in the moment at the beginning of March was that it did not appear to me that the Republicans had as much of an incentive to start the government up again as the Democrats did. That is, there were other ways that, if you think about it, and I'd rather not enumerate them because I don't want to give anybody ideas, but there were a number of ways in which a government shutdown could really, really have helped the people who wanted to destroy the country, wanted to destroy the government. And, the obvious answer to that is, well, how would you have continued to fund the government when you had not raised the debt ceiling? One of the things that's worth looking at are the many ways in which the current MAGA Republicans have evaluated what they consider to be some of America's most valuable assets, which they are suggesting could be marketable. And I would send people back to Project 2025 on that. So like I say, I was a bit of an agnostic on that. I was kind of spoiling for a fight like everybody else was, but that's not necessarily correct, right? So what I see in this...
So basically, you believe a government shutdown could have actually helped Donald Trump.
Oh, yes.
And that's why Chuck Schumer acted the way he did.
Oh, yes. Well, he said that, but he's not the only one. There was a lot of debate over it. And, their argument is slightly different than the argument that I just made. And that's that essentially what they were very concerned about was that the things didn't change a ton under, it's not a continuing resolution, by the way. They didn't change a ton under the new funding. They did change, but not a huge amount. Their concern was that once you had nothing to fund the government, it was not at all clear that the Democrats could get a better deal. And in the meantime, a lot of people would have been hurt, all of which is true. My concerns were slightly different. I never heard them say that they might have. My concerns were that it's always been a problem since the 1980s for the Democratic Party that the Republicans wanted to stop the government from doing things. Well, how do you stop the government from doing things? You just say no. The problem for the Democrats was always that it wanted the government to do things. So somehow it had to get the Republicans to yes. And that has proved largely impossible. And in that particular moment, I was concerned that the Republicans would simply say, nah, we're kind of good with a shutdown. We'll just turn it all over to Donald Trump. And that they could find other ways to fund the government than turning to Congress. So, and of course, Wired had a story about how that's what Elon Musk was hoping for and so on. Whatever. That's behind us. I do think for the Democrats going forward, this is a really important moment, though. And that's that one of the things that I see happening is, in a sense, Chuck Schumer and the people who are essentially keeping the lights on in the government are performing a very important job there. They're trying to wiggle as they can to do the best they can. But that's not where the country is right now. And one of the things that we have seen in the split that you're seeing between Schumer and the people who voted to keep the government in power, keep the lights on, and those like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders, who's not a Democrat, by the way, he's an independent. What you're seeing is this growing fury among Americans, not just among Democrats, but among Americans, of this sense that the world is being destroyed and no one's doing anything. And that momentum is extraordinarily important. And the split in the party permits that to happen. So it permits there to be this voice on the other side. And the place that looks a lot like this to me, although you could also see it in the 1890s, is the 1850s, when, the Republicans tried for a really long time simply to get along with the Democrats in the South, and the Whigs before them did the same thing. And finally, it's when a representative from South Carolina beats Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts, almost to death on the floor of the Senate. So there's blood everywhere because they've cut his head to the bone in 3 places, and he can't fight back because his legs are wedged under his desk, and all these guys are standing around watching him, and they're not helping. And later on, they say, "Well, we didn't think it was our fault." It's after that Northerners finally begin to articulate that they want to stand up and fight. And there's a very famous speech given by a representative from Massachusetts, Anson Burlingame, who says that. He stands up on the floor of the House and he says, we're nice guys over here, and we've been trained to be nice guys at our mother's knees, but we're really good soldiers, and we are willing to fight over this. And I think that that's the moment you're seeing now. Now, one of the things that people have commented on is that that's essentially what's happened with Canada, finally saying, we've been good, nice and good up here for a long time, but we're pissed off now, and we're not going to buy your goods, and we're not going to give you energy, and we're not going to do all this stuff. That ability to articulate not only anger at the current set of affairs, but also with luck to articulate a new formula going forward suggests a new moment in politics. And one of the pieces in that I think is really important, and you and I talked about this before, is that with the murder of the healthcare CEO in New York, we suddenly saw again exploding into the public consciousness issues of wealth and class that we had not talked about since really at least the 1970s and maybe the 1960s. And that fury over the rich guys getting everything, as they really have since 1981, is what motivates a lot of at least the early MAGA votes, the 2016 MAGA votes. And if in fact we see a reshaping of our politics around Why do the billionaires get to do everything and take everything that belongs to those of us who have, for example, paid into Social Security? We could see a really major reworking of American society, the same way we did in the 1860s, the same way we did in the 1890s, and the same way we did in the 1930s, all of which centered around that particular issue.
Interesting. I want to ask before I let you go about some of the other actions taken by the Trump administration, particularly the Department of Defense, which has removed internet pages honoring contributions by women and minority groups. You say this is not just about missing pages, but it's part of a larger effort to reshape history, elevate white men as the sole actors in our history, and attempt to erase a vision of a nation in which Americans of all backgrounds come together to work and fight for the common good. I have been astounded to see this historical erasure. And I'm curious to get more of your opinion on this and what people can do to fight back on this.
So, two separate questions there, but I'm really interested in this concept of what makes a society. So, if you think about the way that Americans have tried to live since at least World War II, tried, mind you, being the operative word, is with a recognition of the importance of everybody in a community. So, in contrast to that, let me throw you back to the way that Americans used to talk about the plantations in the American South, which were talked about as if they belonged to a single man, a single white man, a single white man who enslaved his neighbors because they are his neighbors, and who ruled the women folk and the poor white people around the place where he lived. Now, when they talked in the 19th century and well into the 20th century about those plantations, they would talk about them as, for example, being Charles Chestnut's plantation, as if somehow he did it all. He did the work, he did the thinking, he did the child rearing, he did everything. And one of the things that always surprised me about that was that I live in a really small town. I mean, we mostly all know each other. And it's actually in the winter, probably not much bigger than a really large southern plantation. But it would be like you took all the people who live here, all the things we do, and said that we all belonged to that one guy. That is, it erases all of us and everything we do, and not in the modern world, but well, actually, we do have a blacksmith, but the blacksmithing and the child rearing and the work in the fields and the ironing the clothes and the getting the books and the reading the books and the writing the ledgers and the taking stuff to market and all the things that make a community work. So if you think about that and move that idea to the present and this erasure of the military, the way in which you get rid of all the many different contributions that all people in the military made to create a community, because the military really is a community. What you're essentially doing is you're replacing that worldview that says all of us are important with one that says only the white guys are important, the same way that the old plantations used to be defined by their owner, if you will. And so, what I was trying to get at when I said that was that if you think about a society, if you think about a community, one of the things that I think was really important about the Social Security Act of 1935 is that it says that it's not just the young men who can work hard for a paycheck and the guys who hire them who are important in a community. What it says is that disabled people are important in a community, and elderly people are important in a community, and children are important in a community, not necessarily because we're creating a paycheck, but because of what we bring to that community, in the same way that communities have always worked. Certain people babysit, or, I was thinking this town, we have a guy who is really good about looking after the very, very elderly, just to make sure their walks are plowed. He doesn't get paid for it, and people are never going to mention it, but we need him. And so when I think about the erasure of the code talkers, for example, who are a fascinating story, or the veterans or the Hispanic veterans or the women's veterans, what I see is an attempt once again to erase the community in which the vast majority of us live, and instead create this false world that gives all this credit and power to a very few people based solely on their gender, their skin color, and their wealth. And that is not a world that I'm real keen on living in, and I think the rest of us aren't either.
But to what end?
Well, to me, it seems fairly obvious. If in fact you reduce this country to a paycheck, not to wealth. Wealth is about, what makes a country wealthy? Education, roads, hospitals, quality of life, natural resources, the things that create a good life. If you get rid of all that and you turn that into cash, so that everything in our country is an exchange of cash between people who create things and people who buy things and people who make things, rather as if the government was operating before 1935, when that's really what it did. It oversaw those cash exchanges between employers and employees and resources. If you go back to that system and you get rid of the real wealth of a country and you turn it back into cash, well, then, the guy with the most toys wins. It's a question of amassing as much cash as you possibly can. I would call it an extraordinarily impoverished country, not in society, but I think it's an attempt to amass money and power and to get to Mars. That's another piece of it.
Before we go, I have to ask you about the Voice of America and Trump's attempt to bully and intimidate the news media, saying in that pretty dark speech at the DOJ recently that negative press coverage of him should be quote unquote illegal. I'm sure you've been watching this carefully because one of the institutions, as you said, that is worth supporting and lifting up is the press and a free press. What has your reaction been to some of these events?
Well, I'm horrified by them as other people are. We must have a free press, and then it's also, of course, in our Constitution. It's in the First Amendment to the Constitution, a sign of how important it was to the framers who wrote that Bill of Rights. But I would say a couple of things. One is that I think you can see the drift of certain legacy media outlets toward trying to make sure that they don't upset Donald Trump. And I'm not sure that's because they support him politically, so much as they're very concerned, for example, about his tariffs on China, which will hurt Jeff Bezos, for example, who runs the Washington Post, very badly, which I think he cares about a lot more than whether he cares about the free press in the Washington Post. So I think you can see that drift, but I also think what has been just a wonderful thing to see in this moment is all the new outlets we're seeing, all the new ways that people are finding to communicate with their neighbors. And I think it will be very difficult to shut Americans up. Somebody once said to me that Americans will never put up with authoritarianism because we're too ornery. I would add to that we don't like to shut up and that we will find ways to get our message out. Now, that being said, there are a number of very disturbing conversations going on right now. One of them you may or may not have seen today, that Trump's people have called in the people who run YouTube. And YouTube has actually been increasing its news coverage recently. A lot of new voices and a lot of powerful voices on YouTube.
And that's where this interview will be.
That's right. But right now we haven't been shut up. And I will say, obviously I'm increasing my media presence for this very reason. Although I'm a historian, I promise you, when we get by this moment, I will go away and nobody will ever have to read anything from me except.
I don't think that's true. I think your views will always be important and welcome.
Thank you, but I want to write some books before I shuffle off this mortal coil. But one of the stories that I really love about the Cold War, and I am not I can talk about America and the Cold War. I don't know the countries behind the Iron Curtain. I don't know them at all. So a colleague of mine told me this, and I absolutely love it because we know, of course, the way that democracy really began to spread and ideas about democracy spread into countries where they didn't have access to democracies was through things like rock music. That people listened to this music and simply couldn't believe what they were hearing. And one of the ways that they transmitted this music and one of the ways that historians can tell how and why it was how it was transmitted is that they would impress X-rays with LPs, with albums. They would take the albums and they would press them into X-rays so that you could transport them as X-rays into different areas that didn't have access to that music otherwise. And I think about that, and I think about the ways in which humans have found to make it possible to determine their own destinies, no matter what a group of radicals in control of their government tried to do to them. And I think, that was an extraordinary thing for them to do. And they had lived under authoritarianism for a very long time when they did that. And I think about the United States in this moment, and I think about all the many ways that people are stepping up to the plate to fight back against the idea that we should hand over our government to an authoritarian. And I think that while what the administration is doing is horrific in any number of ways, I can tell you, I would much rather be on the side that's trying to fight back against authoritarianism than on the side that is trying to make 340 million Americans behave in one certain way, because I think we're so ornery and so creative about determining our own destiny. We're going to be a really hard people to gain control of.
Can you think of an example of an authoritarian government being confronted by an angry group of citizens who won't put up with it, and therefore their authoritarian tendencies were not able to take hold?
Well, that we're not able to take hold. I was going to say, look at the many places around the world right now where people are pushing back. So yes, that's certainly been there, but let's not go that far afield. One of the things I always like to point out when we talk about America being a democracy is that, in fact, really, America was not a democracy for a very long time. And it's worth remembering that when the framers wrote the Constitution, the only people who could vote were white men, generally white men of property. And yet, those men were convinced over time to expand who had got to have a right, who had a right to have a say in our government to the present, when in fact, beginning really in 1965, they began to include brown people and black people and women much more aggressively in who got to have a say in our government. How did that happen? That happened by Americans taking to the streets, by Americans demanding their civil rights, demanding the right to have a say in their government, according to the principles that were set out in the Declaration of Independence, which, for all the problems in that declaration, has always given us a touchstone to say that we have the right to the things that are in that declaration, in that document, and to put them into place. So if you want to think about places where people managed to recover democracy and build on democracy, you don't have to look anywhere further than in the American South in the 1960s, where you had people turning out, for example, in Selma, and turning out across Mississippi in the Freedom Summer to make sure people could register to vote, and how that then turned into pressure on the Congress so that Congress passed the 1965 voting rights legislation that now, of course, has been gutted, but we do have the ability to get that back if we are willing to turn out for it.
Heather Cox Richardson, I so appreciate these conversations. Maybe we can talk in another month. I'm sure there will be much to discuss.
It's always a pleasure, Katie.